The snow came down sideways, driven by a wind that bit through clothing like a hungry wolf. Ethan Rollins pulled his worn leather hat lower over his brow and squinted at the horizon. The afternoon light was already failing, painting the Montana wilderness in shades of steel and shadow. Another storm brewing. He could smell it in the air, that particular metallic scent that meant serious weather was coming. His mare nickered nervously beneath him, steam rising from her flanks. She sensed it too. "Easy, girl," he murmured, his voice rough from disuse. 6 more traps to check, then back to the cabin. The thought of the empty rooms waiting for him brought no comfort, just the familiar dull ache that had been his constant companion for 5 winters now. The isolation suited him fine. He preferred the honest brutality of winter to the prying eyes and whispered condolences of the folks in Timber Creek. The mare's ears suddenly pricked forward. She stopped, hooves stamping the snow. "What is it?" Ethan's hand moved instinctively to the rifle in its scabbard. Something dark against the snow, maybe 50 yards ahead, near the edge of the tree line. Probably nothing, a fallen branch or maybe a deer that hadn't made it through the night. But something about the shape made him tense. Ethan urged the mare forward, approaching cautiously. As he drew closer, his breath caught in his throat. Not a branch, not a deer, a girl. She lay crumpled in the snow like a discarded doll, her dark hair spread out against the white. No coat, no shoes, just a thin dress that might have once been white but was now soiled with dirt and melted snow. Her skin had a bluish cast that made his stomach clench. Ethan dismounted stiffly, his boots crunching in the snow as he approached. He crouched beside her, removing his glove to touch her neck, searching for a pulse. Her skin was cold, too cold, but beneath his fingers he felt the faint flutter of life. "Damn it all," he muttered, looking around. No tracks except his own. The wind and fresh snow had erased whatever trail might have led here. Who would leave a girl out here to die? The nearest settlement was 15 miles away. The girl couldn't have been more than 18. Her face, though pale as death, had a certain delicacy to it. Long dark lashes against colorless cheeks. A small birthmark near her temple. Lips tinged blue. Ethan stood, rubbing his beard-stubbled jaw. The smart thing would be to ride on. Let nature take its course. A man living alone couldn't afford to invite trouble, and trouble was exactly what an unconscious young woman represented. Folk were quick to judge, to assume the worst, but if he left her, she'd be dead within the hour. The wind howled, driving fresh snow into his face as if to emphasize the point. The approaching storm would bury her by morning. "God damn it," he growled, decision made. He untied his bedroll from behind his saddle, unfurling his last wool blanket. It wasn't much, but it was warm. He wrapped it around the girl's still form, tucking it carefully around her bare feet, which were already showing signs of frostbite. Then, with a grunt, he lifted her. She weighed almost nothing in his arms, light as a bird with hollow bones. He maneuvered her onto his horse, then mounted behind her, cradling her awkwardly against his chest. "Come on, Sadie," he urged the mare. "Home fast." The horse seemed to understand the urgency, picking her way through the snow with determined strides, heading back toward Ethan's cabin. The girl did not stir, her head lolling against his shoulder with each step. As they rode, Ethan found himself talking, words spilling out after months of silence. "You hang on," he told the unconscious girl. "Just hang on. Got a fire waiting. Get you warm." His voice sounded strange to his own ears. It had been a long time since he'd spoken to another human being. The trappers and traders he occasionally dealt with got little more than grunts and nods. Not since Clara. The thought of his wife sent a familiar pain through his chest. 5 years gone, along with their infant son who'd never drawn breath. Both buried on the small rise behind what had once been their home, now just his prison. The girl in his arms stirred slightly, a small moan escaping her blue lips. "That's it," he encouraged, surprising himself again. "Stay with me." The cabin appeared through the curtain of snow, a dark shape against the white landscape. Smoke still rose from the chimney. The fire he'd banked that morning hadn't died out completely. Small mercies. Ethan dismounted awkwardly, careful not to drop his burden. He kicked the door open and carried the girl inside, laying her on the bearskin rug before the hearth. Working quickly, he built up the fire, adding kindling and logs until flames leapt high. Only then did he turn his attention back to the girl. She was still unconscious, her breathing shallow. The blanket he'd wrapped around her was damp from the snow. It would have to go. Ethan hesitated, acutely aware of the impropriety of the situation. But propriety wouldn't keep her alive. "Sorry, miss," he muttered as he carefully unwrapped the blanket. Her dress was soaked through, clinging to her slight frame. Lips pressed into a grim line, Ethan rummaged through an old trunk, pulling out one of his flannel shirts and a pair of wool socks that Clara had knitted for him long ago. He worked efficiently, averting his eyes as much as possible as he removed her wet dress and replaced it with his shirt, which hung past her knees. Her feet were worryingly pale, toes showing the white patches of incipient frostbite. He rubbed them gently with a cloth, trying to restore circulation without damaging the frozen tissue, then pulled the socks over them. When he was done, he wrapped her in the driest blanket he owned and positioned her closer to the fire. Only then did he attend to his horse, leading Sadie to the small lean-to stable attached to the cabin, removing her saddle and brushing her down before making sure she had feed and water. By the time he returned, the cabin had warmed considerably. The girl still hadn't regained consciousness, but color was beginning to return to her face. Ethan checked her pulse again, stronger now. He allowed himself to exhale. He put coffee on to boil and cut strips of jerky into a pot of water for broth. As he worked, he found himself glancing repeatedly at his unexpected guest. Who was she? How had she ended up alone in the wilderness, dressed for a Sunday service rather than the deadly Montana winter? The answers would have to wait. For now, he had done what he could. The storm was upon them in earnest now, the wind screaming around the eaves of the cabin. They were snowbound, for better or worse. She woke with a scream that jolted Ethan from his uneasy slumber in the chair beside the fire. Her eyes, he could now see they were a striking shade of green, were wide with terror as she scrambled backward, pulling the blanket around herself like armor. "Easy," Ethan said, keeping his distance, hands raised to show he meant no harm. "You're safe." The girl's gaze darted around the cabin, taking in the rough-hewn furniture, the fire, the storm still raging outside the small window. When her eyes returned to Ethan, they were no less frightened. "Who are you?" Her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "Where am I?" "Name's Ethan Rollins. This is my cabin. Found you half frozen in the snow." He gestured to the window. "Storm's got us trapped for now." She pulled the blanket tighter, wincing as she shifted her feet. "Your feet are frostbit," Ethan explained. "Not too bad, I don't think, but you'll need to stay off them." The girl looked down, noticing for the first time that she was wearing unfamiliar clothing. Her eyes widened again and she looked at Ethan with renewed fear. "I had to get you out of your wet things," he said gruffly, feeling a flush of embarrassment. "You were near dead with cold. I was respectful." She didn't respond, just watched him warily, like a cornered animal. Ethan sighed and moved toward the stove. "Broth's ready, if you can stomach it." He ladled some into a tin cup and approached slowly, setting it down within her reach before retreating to his chair. The girl eyed the cup suspiciously. "It ain't poisoned," Ethan said. "If I wanted to harm you, I'd have left you in the snow." After a moment's hesitation, she reached for the cup, her hands trembling so badly that broth sloshed over the sides. She sipped cautiously, then with increasing eagerness as the warmth and nourishment registered. When she'd finished, she set the cup down, still watching Ethan with those large, wary eyes. "Thank you," she said finally, the words clearly costing her some effort. Ethan nodded, then ask the question that had been plaguing him since he'd found her. "What happened to you? Who left you out there?" The girl's face clouded and she looked away. "The brethren," she said softly. "They said I had to be purified." "The brethren?" "The children of the divine revelation. Pastor Simmons leads them." Her voice had taken on a mechanical quality, as if reciting something learned by rote. "They came through our town last spring, said they were gathering the chosen for the coming judgment." Ethan had heard of such groups, religious zealots who traveled the frontier, gathering followers with promises of salvation, snake oil salesmen of the soul. "My pa joined up after Ma died," she continued, "said it was a sign. They seemed kind at first, talked about love and forgiveness." A bitter smile twisted her lips. "That changed once we were on the road." "And they left you to die because—" The girl's cheeks flushed. "They said I tempted Pastor Simmons' son, said I was unclean." Her voice broke. "I never did, though. Never even spoke to him alone. But he told his father I'd offered myself." The familiar anger that Ethan kept carefully banked flared to life. People and their judgments. Their righteous cruelty. "What's your name?" he asked, changing the subject before his anger showed. She hesitated before answering. "Rebecca. Rebecca Miller." "Well, Miss Miller, you're welcome to shelter here until the storm passes and you're well enough to travel. I'll take you to Timber Creek then, if you've a mind to go." "And if I've nowhere to go?" The question hung in the air between them. Ethan had no answer for that. He rose abruptly. "You should rest. I'll be outside tending to the animals." He escaped into the howling storm, needing the bite of the cold to clear his head. What had he gotten himself into? The storm lasted 3 days, during which Rebecca mostly slept, her body recovering from its ordeal. Ethan kept to himself as much as the small cabin would allow, sleeping on a pallet by the door while she took his bed. They spoke little, existing in a careful, awkward truce. On the morning of the 4th day, Ethan woke to find Rebecca standing at the stove, attempting to light the fire with shaking hands. She was still wearing his shirt but had found a pair of his trousers and rolled them up at the ankles. "You shouldn't be on your feet," he said, causing her to start violently and drop the matchstick she'd been holding. "I'm not an invalid," she replied, a flash of stubbornness crossing her face, "and I won't be a burden." Ethan raised an eyebrow but said nothing, moving to take over the fire lighting. Rebecca stepped back, watching him work. "I can cook," she offered, "and clean. I'm good with a needle, too. I noticed your shirt needs mending." "No need," Ethan said, not looking up. "You'll be gone soon enough." The words came out harsher than he'd intended. From the corner of his eye, he saw her flinch. "Of course," she said quietly. "I just thought, while I'm here—" Ethan sighed, raking a hand through his hair. "Look, Miss Miller—" "Rebecca," she interrupted. "Please." "Rebecca, then. I live alone for a reason. I'm not used to company, and I'm not looking to change that." She nodded, her expression carefully blank. "I understand. But please, let me earn my keep while I'm here. I was raised to pay my debts." Something in her quiet dignity gave Ethan pause. He recognized in her the same fierce pride that had kept him going after Clara's death, when it would have been easier to follow his wife and child into the ground. "All right," he conceded, "but mind your feet. They need time to heal proper." A small smile touched her lips, the first he'd seen. It transformed her face, bringing life to features that had seemed almost ghostly before. "Thank you, Mr. Rollins." "Ethan," he corrected gruffly, turning away to hide his discomfort at the warm feeling her smile had stirred. Just Ethan. With the storm past, Ethan needed to check his trap line. Game would be scarce after such weather, and his supplies were running low. He hesitated to leave Rebecca alone, but she assured him she would be fine. "I'll have dinner waiting when you return," she promised. The day was blindingly bright, the fresh snow reflecting the sun like a million diamonds. Ethan's breath clouded before him as he made his rounds, collecting the few rabbits that had been unfortunate enough to find his traps. Not much of a haul, but it would do. As he worked, his thoughts kept returning to the girl in his cabin. Rebecca. She had a quiet strength about her that he hadn't expected. Despite everything she'd been through, there was no self-pity in her, just a determined resolve to move forward. It reminded him uncomfortably of Clara. By mid-afternoon, a familiar heaviness had settled in his chest. He finished his work quickly and headed back, trying to outride the memories that threatened to overtake him. The cabin came into view, smoke rising steadily from the chimney. Through the window, he caught a glimpse of movement, Rebecca moving about inside. For a moment, the sight brought back such a powerful sense of déjà vu that Ethan had to stop and close his eyes. 5 years gone, and still the pain was fresh as yesterday. When he entered the cabin, the aroma of cooking rabbit and herbs greeted him. Rebecca looked up from the stove, that small smile appearing again. "You're back earlier than I expected," she said. Ethan hung his coat by the door. Not much game. Storm drove them deep. Rebecca nodded, turning back to her cooking. She moved with more confidence now, though Ethan noticed she still favored her right foot. "Found some herbs in your stores," she said. "Hope you don't mind. Thought the meat could use some flavor." "Don't mind." Ethan began cleaning his rifle, mostly to have something to do with his hands. The domesticity of the scene was unsettling. They ate in relative silence, but it was a more comfortable silence than before. The rabbit was indeed more flavorful than Ethan's usual fare. He couldn't remember the last time he'd bothered with seasonings. "It's good," he said, surprising himself. Compliments weren't something he dispensed freely. Rebecca ducked her head. "Thank you. My mother taught me to cook. Said a woman's worth was in her kitchen skills." A shadow crossed her face. The brethren didn't approve of such worldly concerns. Said women should focus on prayer and obedience. Ethan snorted. Hard to survive on prayer alone out here. "That's what I thought," but questioning wasn't allowed. She set down her fork. "They took everything from us when we joined. Said personal possessions were sinful. Even my mother's wedding ring." Her voice caught. "My father let them." Anger flashed in her eyes, the first real spark of it Ethan had seen. "Some men are easily led," Ethan said carefully, "especially after a loss." Rebecca looked at him sharply. "You speak from experience." It wasn't a question. Ethan didn't answer, but his gaze drifted to the small shelf above the fireplace, where a simple wooden frame held a daguerreotype of a woman with a gentle smile. Rebecca followed his gaze, understanding dawning in her eyes. "Your wife?" Ethan nodded curtly, rising to clear the plates. "Long time ago." Rebecca didn't press further, but later, as they sat by the fire, she said quietly, "Loss changes people. Makes them desperate for answers." Ethan looked at her, really looked at her, for perhaps the first time. Young as she was, there was an old soul in those green eyes. "That it does," he agreed, "but it's no excuse for throwing your child to the wolves." "No," Rebecca said softly, "it isn't." Days passed, settling into an unexpected routine. Rebecca's feet healed enough for her to move around the cabin without pain, though Ethan still forbade her from venturing outside in the bitter cold. She kept house while he tended to the outdoor chores, and they shared meals in increasingly comfortable silence. One evening, as a fresh snowfall blanketed the world outside, Rebecca asked about the chest of books in the corner, a rare luxury on the frontier. "Clara's," Ethan said, the name coming easier now. "She was a schoolteacher before we married. Couldn't bear to leave her books behind when we came west." "May I?" Rebecca gestured toward the chest. Ethan nodded, watching as she reverently lifted the lid and began examining the volumes inside. Her fingers traced the embossed titles with such longing that Ethan found himself asking, "You read?" Rebecca nodded. "My mother taught me. She was educated, unusual for her time. My father never approved, said it gave women ideas above their station." A wry smile touched her lips. He was right about that, at least. She selected a volume of Wordsworth's poetry and returned to her seat by the fire. As she read, her face softened. The wariness that usually shadowed her features temporarily vanished. Ethan found himself watching her more than the flames, studying the play of emotions across her face as she lost herself in the verses. "Read some aloud," he said suddenly, surprising himself as much as her. Rebecca looked up, startled. "Are you sure?" Ethan nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Clara had often read to him in the evenings. He hadn't heard poetry since her death. Rebecca cleared her throat and began to read, her voice gaining confidence as she continued. "For I have learned to look on nature, not as in the hour of thoughtless youth, but hearing oftentimes the still, sad music of humanity." The words filled the cabin, bringing with them echoes of a life Ethan had thought forever lost. He closed his eyes, letting Rebecca's voice wash over him, carrying him back to evenings with Clara, but somehow not ripping open the wound as he had feared. When she finished, silence fell between them, but it was a different silence than before. Fuller, somehow. "Thank you," Ethan said simply. Rebecca nodded, understanding in her eyes. They said no more about it, but the next evening she read again without being asked, and the next. A week passed, then another. The harshest part of winter began to loosen its grip. Though spring was still a distant promise, Ethan found himself talking more, telling Rebecca about his childhood in Pennsylvania, his journey west with Clara, their dreams of building a life on the frontier. He didn't speak of Clara's death or the child that had never lived, but Rebecca seemed to understand the shape of that silence, respecting its boundaries. In turn, she told him of her life before the Brethren, her mother's gentle guidance, her father's stern but fair hand, the small Missouri town where she'd grown up. How everything had changed after her mother's passing, her father's descent into grief and religious fervor. "I should have run," she confessed one night, "when I first saw how the Brethren treated those who questioned Pastor Simmons, but I couldn't leave my father." "Loyalty isn't a fault," Ethan said. "It is when it leads you to betray yourself." Rebecca stared into the fire. "I knew what they were, but I stayed. Let them break me down bit by bit until I almost believed I deserved what happened." Ethan recognized the self-recrimination in her voice. He'd carried enough of his own. "You survived," he said simply. "That's what matters now." Rebecca looked at him, something unreadable in her gaze. "Yes," she said softly. "I suppose it is." The day came when they could no longer pretend that Rebecca's presence was temporary. Her feet had healed, the weather had improved enough for travel, and Timber Creek awaited. Neither of them mentioned it. Instead, Rebecca began accompanying Ethan outside, first just to feed the chickens and collect eggs, then to help with Sadie and the 2 cows he kept. She wore a pair of his boots, stuffed with rags to fit her smaller feet, and wrapped herself in his spare coat. She proved as capable outside as in, learning quickly and working without complaint. The fresh air brought color to her cheeks and a new brightness to her eyes. Sometimes Ethan caught himself watching her as she scattered feed for the chickens or brushed Sadie's coat, her movements graceful despite the too large clothing. It stirred something in him that he'd thought long dead. One clear, cold morning, Ethan was chopping wood when Rebecca appeared with a cup of coffee. "Thought you might need warming up," she said, offering him the steaming mug. Ethan set down his axe and accepted the coffee with a nod of thanks. As Rebecca turned to go, he found himself saying, "I could teach you to chop wood." She looked back, surprised, then smiled, a full smile this time, not the careful, measured one he'd grown accustomed to. "I'd like that." Ethan showed her how to stand, how to hold the axe, the proper motion for an effective swing. Rebecca was a quick study, though her first few attempts barely bit into the log. "Like this," Ethan said, stepping behind her to guide her arms through the motion. The closeness made him acutely aware of her, the scent of soap in her hair, the warmth of her body against the February chill. He stepped back quickly, clearing his throat. "Try again." Rebecca's next swing landed true, splitting the log cleanly. She turned to him with such pride and joy that Ethan couldn't help but smile in return, his first real smile in longer than he could remember. Something shifted between them in that moment. A recognition, perhaps, of the unlikely bond that had formed in the quiet weeks of winter isolation. That night, as they sat by the fire, Rebecca said suddenly, "I should go to Timber Creek soon." Ethan felt a cold weight settle in his stomach, though he'd known this moment would come. "If that's what you want." "Is it what you want?" Her gaze was direct, challenging. Ethan looked away. "Doesn't matter what I want. You need a proper life, opportunities, not a broken-down rancher and a cabin in the middle of nowhere." "Shouldn't I be the one to decide what I need?" There was an edge to her voice now. "You're young, Rebecca. You don't know—" "Don't tell me what I don't know," she interrupted, anger flashing in her eyes. "I've had enough of men deciding my fate for me." The words hung between them. Ethan realized with a start that he was doing exactly what the brethren had done, assuming he knew best, making choices for her rather than allowing her the dignity of her own decisions. "You're right," he said finally. "I'm sorry." Rebecca's anger faded as quickly as it had appeared. "I'm grateful for everything you've done, Ethan. You saved my life. But I need to know if there's a place for me here, or if I should move on." The question laid bare the fear that had been growing in Ethan since he'd realized how much he'd come to depend on Rebecca's presence. The fear of caring again, of opening himself to the possibility of loss. "I can't offer much," he said gruffly, staring into the fire. "Just a hard life in a rough place." "That's not what I'm asking." Ethan met her gaze then, saw the quiet determination there. "What are you asking?" "I'm asking if you want me to stay." Simple words, but they demanded a truth Ethan wasn't sure he was ready to face. He looked at the daguerreotype of Clara on the mantel, feeling a familiar pang of guilt. "It's not about replacing her," Rebecca said softly, following his gaze. "Nothing ever could. It's about finding a way forward." Ethan closed his eyes, memories washing over him. Clara's laugh, the weight of their stillborn son in his arms, the long, empty years since. But new memories had formed, too, in these quiet weeks with Rebecca. The sound of her voice reading poetry by firelight, the determined set of her jaw as she split wood, the way she hummed to herself as she worked, probably not even aware she was doing it. "Yes," he said finally, the word rough in his throat. "I want you to stay." Spring came early that year. March brought warmer winds and the first tentative signs of new growth. The snow began to recede, revealing patches of earth that had lain dormant through the long winter. Ethan and Rebecca fell into a rhythm, working side by side to prepare for the seasons ahead. There was much to be done: fences to mend, fields to plow, seeds to plant. Rebecca proved as adaptable to these tasks as she had to the winter chores, learning quickly and working tirelessly. They still slept separately, Ethan on his pallet, Rebecca in the bed, maintaining a careful distance despite the growing closeness between them. Some boundaries would take time to cross, if they ever did. Neither seemed in a hurry to define what they were becoming to each other. One morning in late March, Ethan found Rebecca standing in what had once been Clara's garden, now long overgrown with weeds. She was surveying the space with a critical eye. "Thinking of planting?" he asked, coming to stand beside her. Rebecca nodded. "If you don't mind, the soil looks good here, protected from the worst winds." Clara always said the same. The name came easily now, a bittersweet memory rather than a raw wound. She had flowers here, and vegetables there. He pointed to different sections of the plot. I found some seed packets in the storeroom, Rebecca said hesitantly. They're old, but some might still be viable. Take what you need, Ethan said. Garden's been neglected too long. Rebecca looked at him, understanding the deeper meaning behind his words. Sometimes things need to lie fallow for a while. Doesn't mean they can't bloom again. Ethan nodded, unable to speak past the sudden tightness in his throat. Later that day, he watched from a distance as Rebecca knelt in the soil, clearing away dead growth and turning the earth with a small trowel. Her movements were reverent, as if she understood the significance of bringing life back to this particular piece of ground. When she was finished preparing the soil, she stood and saw him watching. Instead of being embarrassed, she smiled and beckoned him over. I saved this for you, she said, holding out a seed packet. I thought, maybe you'd like to plant it. Ethan took the packet, turning it over in his hands. Forget-me-nots, Clara's favorite. The ground's still cold, he said, his voice rough. Might not take. We can try anyway, Rebecca said. That's all any of us can do. Ethan knelt beside the freshly turned earth, his large, calloused fingers awkward as he created a small hollow in the soil. He placed the tiny seeds inside, covering them gently. Now we wait, Rebecca said, kneeling beside him, and hope. Ethan looked at her, this young woman who had appeared in his life like a half-frozen miracle in the snow, who had awakened something in him he'd thought forever lost, who had, without trying, begun to heal the broken pieces of his soul. Hope, he repeated, the word unfamiliar but not unwelcome. I think I remember how that goes. Rebecca's hand found his, her fingers twining with his own. They stayed that way for a long moment, connected in the silence of the coming spring, as new life stirred beneath the soil around them. In the distance, a meadowlark began to sing.